Would you believe it if someone told you they survived 20 years lost alone without technology, without help, without hearing a human voice? Well, almost no one did. They said it was a lie, a fabrication, that he must have been running from something. But the truth has deep roots, and when it blooms, it dismantles even the most skeptical gaze. Samuel's story isn't about survival. It's about emotional endurance, about quiet courage, about a boy who vanished at age 7 and returned as a man who saw what almost no one ever will. A story that begins with a racing heart at a bus station and ends with a reunion that defies logic, reason, and even time. It was a sweltering December morning when little Samuel, just 7 years old, held tightly to his mother's hand at the central bus station. The luggage weighed less than the exhaustion in her eyes, but the boy was distracted, fascinated by the lights, sounds, and overlapping voices of that tangled crowd. 1 second of carelessness was enough, a blink, and then, like a gust of wind scattering dry leaves, he found himself alone. His heart raced. It wasn't just fear of abandonment, it was the internal noise of uncertainty, the chill of sudden solitude, the despair of someone who doesn't even know their full name yet. Not knowing how to ask for help and driven by a mix of fear and hope, Samuel boarded the first bus he saw open, guided only by instinct and a kind of involuntary courage, born right there, between tears and trembling. In that worn leather seat, his eyes scanned the windows as if searching for answers in the landscapes unfolding across the glass. Every tree, every curve of the road was a new mystery. The driver didn't notice the lone boy, maybe because of the rush, maybe because routine dulls the gaze. And there, in the bus's rhythmic sway, Samuel tried to hold back tears and remember his grandmother's words. "When you're scared, my child, talk to your heart. It will guide you." And that's what he did. He felt a pang of invisible affection, as if someone was hugging him from afar. And there began a journey not just physical but emotional, filled with lessons about humanity, compassion, and the importance of kindness, even in the simplest gestures. Soon, he would realize that the world, though vast and strange, still holds seeds of love wherever one goes. The elderly woman beside him, her face marked by wrinkles and wisdom, was the first to notice the boy's frightened silence. Without judgment, with a look of pure empathy and respect, she offered him a piece of bread and a smile. For Samuel, that was like a bridge between despair and a reconciliation with his own courage. She didn't ask many questions, just shared stories from her childhood, as if watering the dry soil of the soul with words of affection and hope. In that moment, without realizing it, Samuel absorbed lessons of humility, understanding, and the powerful magic of kindness. And with each kilometer traveled through mountains and unknown towns, he discovered there is strength in vulnerability, that fear can be a wise teacher, and that sometimes getting lost is the only way to truly be found. But of course, he had no idea what awaited him at the next stop. While Samuel faced unfamiliar roads back at the bus station, the echo of his name was already ringing in desperate cries. His mother, in panic, ran between ticket booths, pushing at the air with her hands as if trying to grasp lost time. "Oh, he's right here, I swear he was here," she repeated, almost voiceless, as curious and indifferent eyes watched. The chaos began right there. A whirlwind of fear, uncertainty, and guilt settled over the family like fog. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath their feet, leaving only the raw pain of absence. And in that void, the community too was seized by a collective feeling of empathy and commotion, with neighbors, acquaintances, and even strangers uniting in tireless search for a response that wouldn't come. Posters were pasted on poles, walls, and bus stops. Groups of volunteers formed, combing alleys and dirt roads, praying to find any trace. His grandmother, with strength born of faith and unconditional love, walked kilometers with his photo in hand, offering trembling smiles and promises of gratitude to anyone who could help. "He's a good boy. He's only 7. His name is Samuel. Have you seen this little face?" she said, between tears and hope. On the town radio, between cheesy songs and repeated news, the message echoed, "Help us find Samuel." But time, that old thief of hope, began to wear down the energy of those searching. What was once an outcry turned into uncomfortable silence. What was once certainty became an improbable theory, and each day without news removed another brick from the wall of trust. As the months went by, Samuel's name stopped being a topic of conversation. His face, once vivid in the neighborhood's memory, became just another faded photo on the police station's missing persons board. The police chief, tired of repeating the same story, simply muttered, "Another case with no solution." The family, on the other hand, never gave up, but they no longer slept either. It was like mourning without a body, a bottomless hole. His father, in silence, sank into drinking. His mother, who once embroidered hope on cold nights, now stitched just to forget. And the younger sister started talking to the walls, as if her brother was still there, invisible. In moments like these, we realize how fragile humanity can be, and how forgiveness, compassion, and kindness are the only threads that keep the soul from tearing apart. Yet even when everything seemed lost, something subtle still lingered in the air, something that refused to die. The first days away from everything he knew were a plunge into the abyss of uncertainty. Samuel, now in a city he barely knew the name of, wandered aimlessly, his bare feet blistering, his hands grasping at emptiness. His stomach growled, and so did his heart, hungry for food, yes, but also for affection, for answers. He slept wherever he could, beneath awnings, on park benches, wrapped in cardboard and clinging to instinct. Each restless night birthed a flicker of courage, not the kind from movies, heroic and grand, but real courage, quiet, the kind that gets up even without knowing where to go. The compassion he once found in his mother's embrace now had to be sought in the eyes of strangers. And when kindness came, in the form of a shared piece of bread, a forgotten blanket, it felt like the world, for a few seconds, remembered it still had humanity. Hunger was the first enemy. Then came the cold. Samuel quickly learned that survival wasn't just about eating, it was about keeping the mind awake, the heart steady. There were days he scavenged trash bins, days he followed stray dogs thinking they knew where food was, and days he simply lay on the ground and cried in silence. Nature at first seemed to mock him. The wind was cutting, the rain punishing, the nights filled with sounds more frightening than comforting. But with time, he began to understand the rhythms of the trees, the birds' songs, the warmth, the sun offered like a quiet embrace. And there, in that silent exchange with the world, a deep understanding was born, that even what seems hostile can be a teacher, and that respect for life, all of it, is the only path to keeping one's sanity. One morning, waking beside a shallow stream, Samuel saw a butterfly land on his arm. It was a small detail, almost invisible, but to him it was a sign, a reminder that even in chaos, beauty exists. He began observing more, the paths of ants, the leaves that provided shelter, the low-hanging branches that offered fruit. He started learning through practice the value of ancestral wisdom, the kind not found in books, but etched into the skin, into the senses. And there, in the improvisation of survival, a new Samuel began to emerge, stronger, more connected, more grateful. Life was still harsh, but hope, that stubborn fire, no longer went out so easily. The boy who once hid from the wind now walked alongside it. But the journey was far from over, and something unexpected was approaching the horizon. The days began to stack like stones on an improvised trail, and Samuel, now thinner and more calloused, understood that survival was more than endurance. It was creation, adaptation, reinvention. With a mind sharpened by necessity and a body guided by intuition, he began to notice patterns in nature. He learned, for instance, that where there were large ants, there were usually edible roots nearby, that the sound of cicadas could signal incoming rain, and that sudden silence in the forest was a clear warning of danger. Wisdom seeped into him like wind through a crack, silent and vital. With dry sticks and vines, he built his first rudimentary shelter. Nothing fancy, of course, but enough to protect him from the weather and wandering eyes. Each night spent there, wrapped in leaves and courage, was a lesson in hope, gratitude, and above all, trust in himself. Hunting was a chapter of its own, not out of desire but sheer necessity. It wasn't about weapons or brutality, it was about observation, patience, and humility before the cycle of life. First came insects, a source of protein that, at that point, felt like a feast. Later, he learned to build simple traps with rocks, sticks, and improvised fiber ropes. One day, he managed to catch a small rodent and cried before killing it. He whispered an apology, as if the forest itself were listening. That gesture, simple and sincere, was the mark of his intact compassion. With a piece of tin he'd found in an abandoned dump, he fashioned a kind of knife. He was no longer just the lost boy. He was a boy shaped by nature, by forced lessons, by pain, and by resilience. Fear still walked with him, of course, but now it walked alongside wisdom and experience. At that point, the stories being born inside him began to seem too unlikely, even to the one who had lived them. After all, who would believe that a 7-year-old built shelters from mud and leaves, or that he survived months eating roots and small poisonous fruits he learned to neutralize in running water? How could anyone believe he used stones to warm himself during cold nights, or that he drew mental maps of the trails to avoid getting lost on return trips? It was as if, little by little, the forest ceased to be a threat and became an ally. A silent pact was born there between the boy and nature, sealed with affection and mutual respect. And between falls, cuts, and new beginnings, Samuel understood something that many adults never reach: that life's kindness is often hidden behind the harshness of the road. But the outside world still wasn't ready to hear any of this. Time, little by little, lost its name. There were no more days or nights, only cycles. The sunrise became just the announcement of another challenge, and the sunset, a reminder that he had survived once more. The months turned into an indistinct pile of silences, of waiting, of conversations with his own heart. Samuel no longer remembered the sound of his own voice, and sometimes hummed made-up tunes just to feel a little less invisible. Loneliness was his only constant companion, a tamsi, cold presence, but paradoxically, where he began to find a rare kind of understanding. And then, like a whisper from within, his grandmother's words returned. "Have faith, my son, and never give up. Even when no one else believes, you must go on." That became his mantra. In the middle of nowhere, his soul anchored itself in her wisdom, in the counsel woven with love and kindness. With his feet firm on the ground and his gaze lost in the sky, Samuel reflected on the past as someone who observes a scar. With pain, yes, but also with a strange gratitude. He missed his mother, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the way she fixed his bangs. He missed his father, even though he rarely spoke. His little sister, the sound of cutlery on the plate, neighbors laughing loudly on Sundays. Each memory was an invisible thread that still connected him to humanity. But those threads, although thin, never broke. And it's curious how, even without seeing a face or hearing a name for years, he never lost his empathy. On the contrary, it grew. It grew like the roots of the trees that sheltered him, and on the darkest days when hope threatened to die, he would remember, "Have courage, my boy. God hears even the thoughts we're too afraid to speak." It was his grandmother's voice, always hers. Once, upon finding a cave partially shielded by moss and rocks, he decided to make it his refuge. There he would light small fires and scratch symbols into the walls, as if writing for someone who might read them one day. A chronicler of his own exile. Sometimes he spoke to God, other times to his father. On some days he simply screamed, just to hear the echo affirm his existence. And so, in the absence of human voices, he learned to listen to his own heart. Nature became his confidant, his teacher, his mirror, The rain cradled him, the wind advised him. There was something sacred in that solitude, something that taught him about humility, about hope, about the power of kindness that still pulsed within him. At each memory of his grandmother, faith reignited. He had changed, it was true. But deep down, he still hoped. He hoped to be found, hoped that someone, somewhere, still believed in his story. It was on a grey morning after a night of rain that seemed to wash his thoughts that Samuel saw something that made him freeze. Tire tracks in the muddy ground, still fresh. There was no doubt. Someone had been there, and not long ago. His heart, which had beat in a slow and resigned rhythm for years, now raced like in those first days of escape. His legs trembled. Fear returned. But it wasn't the same fear. It was fear of the unknown, of breaking the wild routine that, paradoxically, brought him comfort. And then, like a gesture scripted by divine hands, he heard voices. Human. Alive. A group of environmental researchers was exploring the area for records of endangered species, and when they came across Samuel, they first thought it was a collective hallucination. A man covered in dirt with wild eyes and a thick beard, emerging from the foliage like a myth. But he was real. It took hours before he could say anything intelligible. His tongue felt locked, the muscles of speech forgotten. But emotion, that poured from his eyes. One of the biologists approached with empathy, spoke softly, knelt down, like someone, speaking to a frightened child, and that's exactly what Samuel still was deep inside. A boy who hadn't grown in time, only in body. Carefully, they offered him clean water, a blanket, and what moved him most, a hug. A simple gesture, but filled with affection, kindness, and above all reconciliation with the world he thought he had lost. Little by little, he was brought back to civilization. But this return wasn't a joyful reunion. It was a brutal impact. The city now seemed made of harsh lights, unbearable noise, people too hurried to notice what really mattered. Samuel felt like a stranger, not in the land, but in time. The buildings were gigantic, the screens omnipresent. People spoke more to their devices than to each other. Samuel looked around as if watching a science fiction film. Where were the porch conversations, the eye contact, the simplicity of things? He felt a mix of sadness and fascination, a duality that hurt but also sparked curiosity. The world had moved on without him, and that was a silent kind of mourning, but also a chance to start over. Despite the shock, he found temporary shelter with an NGO, where he received medical care, clothes, and most importantly, someone to listen. For the first time in years, he was able to share fragments of his story. Many doubted. Others were moved. But the most important thing was that he began to rediscover something long lost, his voice. And with it came the certainty that maybe, just maybe, his story was only beginning to be heard. When Samuel decided to return to the town where he was born, something inside him still whispered the word home with ancient tenderness. But as he crossed the town's entrance, he realized nothing was as he remembered. The streets had different names. The small square with the bandstand had become a parking lot, and the blue house on the corner, where he used to steal mangoes with his cousin, was now a cold, modern pharmacy. His chest tightened. It felt like visiting a place from an old dream where everything had changed, except the memory. With teary eyes and hesitant steps, he walked to the neighborhood where he once lived. He expected familiar faces, smiles, maybe a warm hug. But he found closed gates, suspicious stares, and a silence that screamed. No one recognized him. It was as if he had been erased from the town's history. And it was there, standing in front of his old house, that he understood. The world had forgotten him, but he remembered everything. His mother was no longer there. She had passed away a few years back, according to an old shopkeeper who vaguely remembered an old case of a missing child. His father had moved to the countryside, reclusive and bitter. His sister, now an adult, lived in another city, married with children, who ironically had eyes just like his. Samuel listened to everything with respect, but felt a deep pain. It was like visiting his own grave while still alive. The boy who disappeared had been mourned, emotionally buried, moved on from, not out of coldness, but out of survival. Life had gone on as it always does, with or without permission. And there, surrounded by memories and a street that no longer recognized his steps, he was swept by a wave of compassion for his mother, who had suffered so much, for his sister, who grew up with questions, and for himself for having lived an involuntary exile. Yet even so, there was one thing the modern world could never take from him: his memory. He spent the following days wandering like a ghost through the sidewalks of his childhood. He sat on the bench in the square where he used to eat popsicles with his grandmother. He watched children laughing, chasing pigeons, unaware of the weight of life. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he cried. He went to the police station where there was still an old board with missing person photos. There, in the lower right corner, was a faded image. Him. It cut through him like a blade. He stood there for long minutes, not because of the photo, but because of what it meant. It was the portrait of someone the world had left behind, but who had survived with hope, faith, and love. It was a living reminder that even when everything seems lost, the power of kindness and persistence can still bring someone back to life. And in that moment, something stirred, not sadness, but a kind of inspiration. He didn't need to search for home anymore. Maybe he could build a new one. When Samuel finally decided to tell his story, he expected disbelief, but not the weight of suspicion. Sitting before reporters, police officers, psychologists, and curious onlookers, he recounted the details with the raw sincerity of someone who had survived, not someone rehearsing a tale. He spoke of caves, makeshift shelters, living with nature, sleepless nights spent talking to God and to silence. But instead of empathy, the looks returned suspicion. No one just disappears. For 20 years, they said. Others insinuated he was running from something. Some swore he chose isolation, as if a 7-year-old could choose to vanish from his own life. His words were received as delusions, his experience treated as a hoax. And that hurt more than hunger, more than cold. It was like being ripped, once more from a safe place. Except now the abandonment came with accusations. An investigator, the kind with a cynical grin and eyes trained to spot lies, said, "Sounds like another made-up story. Where's the proof? Who's to say you didn't run away by choice?" Samuel swallowed hard. How do you prove scars that don't show on the outside? How do you explain the trauma of a broken heart, a calloused soul? There were no records, no traces, just marks on his body and a light in his eyes that only someone who had faced the impossible carried. A more sensitive psychologist tried to intervene, sensing that something real, something visceral was there, but even so, skepticism prevailed. Modern society demands proof, evidence, data, and all Samuel had was his voice, his memory, his pain. And the cruelest part, even what he had lived with compassion, with hope, with courage, was now treated coldly, as if it were nothing more than a poorly told fable. His truth became someone else's fiction. There were days he thought of going silent, of leaving everything behind again, hiding in a place where he wouldn't be judged for simply trying to survive. After all, the world doesn't quite know what to do with people who defy logic. But then he remembered his grandmother, her unshakable faith, her firm voice saying, "The truth always finds a way to bloom." And that gave him strength. He kept speaking, a little quieter, more reserved, but still with the conviction of someone who had lived every detail. He wasn't seeking fame or pity, only to be heard. He wanted perhaps just someone to say, "I believe you," because sometimes a sentence like that is more powerful than any court, any headline. It was emotion, it was affection, it was the recognition of humanity itself. But the struggle was far from over. Society's judgment was just the beginning of a new battle, and Samuel still had much to face. What began as distrust was slowly worn away by something no one expected: the nearly impossible consistency of the details. Samuel described with astonishing precision a hidden grotto 7 kilometers from the last known trail point, a place even local biologists had never catalogued. He spoke of stones forming a natural cross in the cave's ceiling, of a spring nearby, of trees marked by cuts made with a shard of tin, and it was all there, exactly as he had said. The team that once doubted him began documenting each piece of evidence with keener eyes: marks of old traps, remnants of improvised tools, symbols etched into walls. The scars on his body, on his feet and hands, spoke for themselves. Each was a silent testimony of survival. And before such proof, even the toughest critics fell silent. It was impossible to deny there was truth there. An uncomfortable truth, but undeniable. Later, he mentioned a lady who once gave him bread on a bus when everything was just beginning. No one knew who she was, until, during an interview sparked by curiosity, an elderly woman recognized the name and the story. "Yes, I remember. That boy seemed to have the world in his eyes and the world on his back." And she cried. That was when the press, which had once painted Samuel as a mystery or a fraud, began to treat him as a survivor. Documentaries began to be planned. Old acquaintances, once distant, came forward, not out of fame but out of emotion. A boy who lived 20 years alone in the wilderness and returned with more love than bitterness. That wasn't just rare, it was pure inspiration. It was humility turned into a living story. People began listening with new ears, and each sentence he spoke now carried the weight of a truth that had outlasted time and survived. In a powerful moment, he was taken to a rural school near where he had survived. As he looked over the land, he walked directly to where he had once buried an object, a piece of cloth with his grandmother's initials embroidered by hand. It was there, dirty but intact. Those present said nothing for long minutes. The scene spoke for itself. It was as if the world at last was asking forgiveness for having doubted him. A teacher accompanying the visit said, "This is more than proof. It's a miracle with witnesses." And indeed, the doubt dissolved like mist in sunlight. It was no longer just about Samuel. It was about what he represented: compassion in the form of survival, hope alive, faith made flesh. And there, before eyes now full of respect, he began to realize that maybe his mission wasn't just to survive. Maybe it was to teach. When the story hit national headlines, crossing radios, newspapers, and phone screens, names from the past began to resurface like roots that had never truly died. It was on a warm afternoon, while Samuel was having coffee with volunteers from the NGO that had taken him in, that the news came. They had located his father and sister. His heart raced as if reliving that day at the bus station. His head spun. The boy inside him cried out for affection, but the man feared the reunion. He didn't know if he would be welcome. He didn't know if he still belonged in that world. But he went. His sister came first, crying like someone who finds a piece of themselves they thought was lost. Then came his father, older, shorter, burdened by the weight of 2 decades of guilt. The hug between them wasn't immediate, but when it came, it was filled with silence, forgiveness, and humanity. It was as if all the unsaid words were there, stitched into time with respect and compassion. And now I ask you, how many incredible stories do we stop believing just because they don't fit into our logic? How many times have you doubted someone's pain just because it was too quiet? Samuel didn't just survive time. He survived indifference, forgetfulness, and judgment. And even so, he chose not to harden. He chose love, reconciliation, and gratitude. He chose to forgive the world for leaving him behind. And you? Which path are you choosing? Will you keep living on autopilot, or will you make space for the power of kindness to transform your journey too? How many times have you lost yourself and thought there was no way back? This story isn't just about a lost boy. It's about all of us, about the times we felt invisible, misunderstood, disconnected. But there is a way back. There always is. So if this story touched you, If it sparked something inside, a calling, a reminder, a flicker of hope, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come with us to discover more stories that heal, inspire, and teach us that life, even in its longest silences, is still full of new beginnings.